Hey guys, take 2 of our new podcast. We're starting to review Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man. And CJ was kind enough to transport his talents from the discussion of Nietzsche's On the Birth of Tragedy to Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man. And this is a strange text. I think something that I think is really cool. What we're doing here is we're taking a thinker that is primarily known to be a poetical literary figure and a cultural icon in Germany. And through this podcast, we're introducing him to a much wider audience in America, where he is not widely taught, especially, or at least not in philosophy departments.
Why do you think that? Is just his obscurity, or is it more so just the ideas in this text and in his philosophy is quite confounding and confusing? Or
well, I'd have to say that, I mean, it would require some degree of expertise for me to pronounce with certainty why Schiller isn't taught more extensively. I can take
maybe a guess, yeah.
I definitely have some hypotheses about it. I would think his the corpus of his literary work overshadows his philosophical work. The language is impenetrable, which makes it, despite its brevity, makes it hard for individuals to latch on to it. I think I don't know. I think you could talk about how certain curriculum in the United States are structured by certain people that haven't been exposed to Schiller in one way or another. Like, it's a question of who decides the canon, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Are there brilliant works of philosophy and literature that are left, or music, that are left out of the canon just because the people in charge aren't aware? I think that probably has something to do with it too.
And that implies the canon in general, where it's just like everybody's gonna have holes in their game, and I'm sure, you can say like, I know of such and such philosopher, I know of Schiller, but I don't really know what he's talking about, So I mean, I feel like we all have holes, or like everybody has holes, but maybe this little podcast can be a noble effort to maybe fill out that hole.
Yeah,
even if it's just temporary gravel,
Yeah,
it's just something like that.
It's really cool to be a participant in it, and it may be something as simple as a pragmatic issue. I'm not exactly sure when the book was translated. It may come down to it didn't have a proper translation until relatively recently, like Kierkegaard's work was known on the European continent for a great deal longer than it was known on the North American continent until a couple named the Hongs did a massive effort where they translated everything, which really instilled in me a sense of respect for translators that I never did before. Because if you think about it, and I'm digressing a little bit, but I think it's a worthwhile digression, is that if you think about the role of translators, there's so much intellectual content out there that the West doesn't know about because there just aren't enough people who've translated and popularized it in the correct way. Think about it. Like, how many Russian philosophers could you name?
I mean, none really.
That
aren't literary, right? Because you think of
Chekhov and Dostoevsky.
Right,
and Tolstoy.
exactly, right. But they're writers, even though, their style and their philosophies are more from their literary works than anything.
Does that mean there were no Russian philosophers ever?
Right. No,
how many Chinese philossiphos do we know?
Well,
like 3? Or Indian philosophers, or Filipino. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. There could be all these worlds of knowledge that just were cut off from because of the language. And I guess I want to salute all the translators out there because they really do essential work.
Right. No, exactly. I think that's so true. And then you have to take into account trying to do that. Translating is one thing, but then trying to make it seem poetic. Yeah, like if it's poetic, like make it seem poetic or make it seem dry, like fit the style of the author, or to just translate it in a way that makes it almost kind of like your own thing, where it's like you're kind of adding yourself to it, which is interesting. And it kind of like what we're trying to do here is kind of, in a sense, translate what Schiller is saying into something that that I could latch, or that we could latch on to, and that other people can latch on to.
Because he does have something to say that we can latch on to. Like,
right.
It's and this, we're doing sort of an overview here, but I mean, I think this is a really worthwhile text to study.
Sure. So why should we translate this? You know.
Yeah. And why do we have to translate it?
Right.
Too, right. We're kind of there. It may be a result of just a natural barrier between the German and English languages, but it's because Schiller is operating off of certain type of German idealist philosophy or whatever that's sort of popularized by Kant and Hegel, and he's kind of somewhere in between. He's in that mix of people who are, so even when it's in English, even though we can read Schiller and Kant and Hegel and all these people in English or whatever, we still have to sort of translate it into modern English or American English in order for it to really make any sense. But why the book is important is that Schiller thinks that the political just state and beauty are very much interconnected, and I think this book is really important for artists because a lot of people probably ask both you and I why we make art. Right?
Or anybody, yeah,
or why anybody, right? And it's hard to say, right? Like, we were like, or people would be like, "Oh man, CJ just must love the guitar," and or like Luke just really loves making that music, and it kind of, that's true and untrue, right? Like, it's true, we do love these things, but it simplifies what we do. It makes it sound like you love the guitar in the same way that you love jelly beans. Like,
right. Oh, sure. It's like that, the whole like cheesecake kind of thing where it's just like, oh, it's cool to have, like, like I'll have cheesecake, but if I didn't have it, that's okay. It's just kind of like it's a superfluous sort of thing that you do, and that it doesn't really have a kind of moral or ethical weight to it. It's just there. Well,
Schiller is going to make the case over the course of these 27 correspondences or these letters or whatever, that art is indispensable for bringing about political freedom.
Yeah.
And that may seem obvious on some level. Like, I think people are like, oh yeah, like protest movement, protest songs, like Peace Man, like, because people do that to us all the time. Because we hang out with a bunch of caricatures of Woodstock attendees, but I think people assume that music can change the world or can usher in the just state or something like that. But it's the case that Schiller is going to make. It's not going to be the case that people think. Like, I don't know. If I were to speculate, I mean, I'm talking a lot, so
it's okay.
Yeah. If I were to speculate how people think that music could change the world, they think like maybe like if they put like a certain ideology in song, like you'll be able to teach people it, and then like it'll be like teaching people their ABCs. You'll just teach them the truth.
Right. Or that I guess what you're trying to say is that art is malleable to a certain ideology or an idea, and that Schiller is saying it's actually art that's the thing that it's not the ideology, it's beauty that's actually doing the work for freedom and for political change. It's not an ideology and then that gets transferred into art. Well, it is art in itself that changes things.
Right. And the reason why we have to think about, I mean, what would we have if ideology was driving art? What would we have?
Right. I mean,
what does that sound like to you?
Sounds like a kind of, I don't know, like a communist state.
It sounds like propaganda.
It sounds communist totalitarian propaganda. Yeah,
or like exactly. Nazi war hymns, or or even something closer to us. I mean, even our own sort of jingoistic anthems, or like when religion is like, I don't know, like Christian rock.
Sure.
Why is Christian rock so terrible?
Yeah.
I mean, it's terrible on a lot of levels, but like it's primarily driven by ideology. Like when art is driven by ideology, the art tends to be kind of sucky. And But that's, or not. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of, and I'm trying to think of, I don't know, what we just tackled in Birth of Tragedy and how that, I mean, I don't know, I'm saying it was driven by an idea. Well, maybe that's where the difference comes in, where it's driven by like a metaphysical kind of, I don't even know if that's if you call that ideology, or it's just the way things are that, and maybe that's why I think this is such a great spiritual successor, because Schiller, like Nietzsche, is trying to describe a metaphysical depiction of the universe where art and aesthetics and beauty are one of the main drivers of that world.
Yeah, it's
so that art in itself is a life force.
It is,
in a way. Yeah.
So. But we should emphasize a difference between Nietzsche and Schiller. So what? The difference is buried in the title of Schiller's, on the aesthetic education of man. So Schiller is going to think that art in some way, not in an ideological communication way, but in some way is going to be didactic. I mean, it's going to be educative. It's going to enlighten man. But we know from our study of Nietzsche, what does Nietzsche think about that? That he would say that's what?
So that'd be like Socrates.
That's Socratism, right? So this is where Nietzsche and Schiller part ways. Whereas, Nietzsche is going to see any attempt for art to teach man a moral or a lesson or something like that is like getting away from that aesthetic justification of life.
And the fascinating thing is that they both use the Greeks in that kind of, touchstone. Granted, I mean, maybe in different ways, but we're gonna see at least the Greeks pop up again as this kind of ideal sort of, dare I say, Ubermensch sort of thing, like we're like, this is where he's gonna say like aesthetic education, like that's where it is, that's where it's at.
It's almost like Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy applies to the early Hellenic people, and you could maybe make the case that Schiller would have been more in line with the Alexandrian, or what Nietzsche calls the Alexandrian culture or whatever. So maybe Schiller would have been closer to Socrates and Euripides and
Nietzsche.
Who would we say Nietzsche would be closer to?
He'd probably be closer to Homer. Homer. No, not Homer. No,
you wouldn't say Homer. Nietzsche's his own man, I guess.
Yeah, but maybe to Dionysus and that kind of Dionysus, tragedy, Greek tragedy. I mean, I guess we can't really put it to the satyrs. I mean, I don't know what he would be.
Yeah, I wonder. We'd have to go back and reference some of the names.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thing, though. At least I don't know, where Greeks are this touchstone for aesthetics. And it's just something that we have to kind of deal. Yeah, we have to deal with. Even like in today's culture, where it's like we like to think we're moving forward and stuff. And maybe and of course, people did as well back then. But that we kind of have to look back and take into account other cultures and maybe see them as as these philosophers have seen them as this kind of touchstone for living and trying to learn from them.
I just think it's so fascinating, going back to what we're saying about translators, how people get so hung up on the Greeks, but like presumably throughout the history of the world, there are going to be other outcroppings of like tremendous intellectual activity, but because of the focus on the Greeks, and we see that here, ironically, we see that here with both Schiller and Nietzsche. And maybe that prevented Schiller from gaining acceptance in America because it's there being sort of prejudicial tendencies about what gets translated or not. Mm-hmm. We think about all the different other cultural explosions there may have been that were neglected because German thinkers were looking to the Greeks and not elsewhere.
Granted, too, I think what's interesting about Schiller is that he's not as exclusive as Nietzsche. That he gives more of a framework of this ideal aesthetic education. And he doesn't really say, like, the Greeks were the only ones. He says, like, this is the framework through which good civilizations, like, I can maybe name them on my one hand, maybe. Mm-hmm. but it's not just the Greeks, it's out there somewhere. So he's kind of giving us a framework to then, if we can, dig back and maybe even just look around and say, like, oh, look, is that society practicing an aesthetic education, or like, are they practicing aestheticism? Like, who's just focused on beauty, who's just being sensuous? Just like trying to. I think this is the interesting thing.
You don't think Nietzsche could? You don't think we could map the world in Nietzsche's terms?
Oh, we could.
Well? Yeah,
I think we could too. But I think that's
I feel like we could create two culture intellectual maps. You know, like if you have, you could have different ways of seeing the world in terms of maps or whatever. Like you could have like a map that is based on how you carve up the world in regards to provinces, or you could have like a map in regards to altitude.
Right.
I feel like you could kind of have two. I feel like we could create maps, visual maps of how you apply these different ideas of aesthetics.
And I think that's why it's so important, why we're doing it, at least because, I mean, I think like you were saying before, it's just like, I am a poet, and I don't really know why. Like, I know where I'm going, but I don't have... It's not even so much having a map, but it's just I don't have a compass. I don't really know what's due north. Like, I know I'm a poet. I know that's what I do.
Yeah.
But, like, we can't... And I think we can't really articulate it, or we can't really tell ourselves why we do what we do or why it's good. So I think... At least what we're doing in exploring these texts is almost giving a language and almost kind of giving a compass. And like you said, maybe a map as well. Maybe not necessarily, it's kind of a vague map, but maybe giving people different, like this is north, this is due north, this is due south. So you can have kind of, maybe you're not sure where you're going, but you kind of know where due north is. Like, you know what Nietzsche is saying about this, about the Apollinian or about the Dionysian. You're like, okay, that's how I can describe that. Or then maybe you take Schiller and the aesthetics. You're like, okay, that's aesthetics being practiced there. This is that. This is that. So, but I think giving people a compass, or at least like trying to see how other people have constructed compasses, and then seeing how maybe we can construct our own compass in trying to understand what we do and how we articulate and everything. I think that's really important. I think these texts try to explore that in some way, and I think that's why it's at least a noble task to translate them and to read them and to think about these things. So I think that's why it's so important.
I really want to take the metaphor and run with it about these different maps and
yeah,
why we need them.
Yeah.
But that's a conversation for another day about why we need different intellectual paradigms and what goods they serve.
Yeah. I mean, because that's kind of just... Yeah, I mean, but I feel like that is important though, because that's what we're doing. I mean, even more than fascinating, it almost seems essential because, like we need to understand what we're doing. I mean, granted, like some people, like we can go through our craft or whatever and kind of be sort of knowledgeable of what we're doing and sort of not. I mean, I'm guilty of that, but I think it really helps to kind of have a narrative. Yeah. I mean, as humans, we are, narrative driven, I feel like. So, I mean, having a kind of, not so much like I like map, but I like to think more of like a compass, to have some kind of compass.
Yeah. Well, I think this book will give artists a narrative. And I think it's going to be important because it kind of breaks them out of the hippie stereotype of like, I'm going to write a folk song that's going to change the world. Mm-hmm. And you start to see maybe it's not that art can't change the world, it's just going to change it in a different way. Mm-hmm. And
in what way? I mean, if you can give a vague, is it more like a personal thing? Maybe it's not so much the world, but maybe it's somewhat like an inner paradigm, or like what do you?
My understanding of Schiller is that the art, at least the way that he'll talk. I don't want to be so categorical about it because he will talk about what art does for the individual human mind, because he spends a great deal of time, not unlike Nietzsche and nearly everyone else we're going to ever look at ever. Yeah. He ends up carving up the mind. Like we saw Nietzsche carve up the mind into the Apollinian and the Dionysian, and you know what? We're going to draw parallels to Nietzsche in this text all over the place.
Well, that's good. I mean,
it's good.
That's what we should be doing. Like, anybody should be doing. But then connecting the dots, and then also just kind of saying like, okay, they run parallel to each other. They don't really meet in the middle.
Well,
so,
yeah,
that's fine.
We saw that in Nietzsche with the example of tragedy. We saw two impulses, an Apollonian and Dionysian impulse, and then he dwelled on how they interact in a special synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Right? Well, the interesting thing about Schiller is that he's kind of like, they actually just run parallel, or at least that we need another. Granted, Nietzsche also said we need another, but he said that was both of these together. Well, Schiller's going to argue that like we have reason and then, reason and then the sensuous, but they never interact with each other, that they're on these two separate spheres, and that we need something else to contemplate beauty. So, I mean, that's going to be a weird kind of thing to kind of understand that, because...
Yeah, he's kind of talking about there going to need to be a third faculty.
Sure, yeah. It's so odd to me, because it's like we live in a world where everything's kind of mixed together, where we kind of think like, okay, Descartes was wrong, where we don't have reason over here and have emotions over here. We're kind of this weird synthesis of reason and emotion, and all these things kind of jumble up together, but to have this neat kind of, no, reason's over here, the sensuous is over there, and we're going to, make something else. It's interesting to, I guess, a 21st century mind.
I want to say that I want to say that might be an oversimplification of Schiller, because
that's great. So then we're gonna tackle that. Maybe that's my oversimplification of it.
No, and I don't mean, but I mean I can understand why you would say that Schiller seems to tidy it up and say that man's rational side is here and his sensuous side is here. Mm-hmm. I think he thinks the actual state that people find themselves in is much messier than that. I think just for schematizing purposes, he'll maybe talk about individuals being closer to this or closer to that in sort of a representative way. But, I don't think he thinks the brain can be so carved up so finitely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and I can understand that. There's a lot of stuff in the details.
There is.
Yeah. So, but something... we're at 22 minutes here, and I think we've done a pretty good job sort of introducing why this text ought to matter to artists. I think we've done a pretty good job at connecting it to people that maybe were interested in our work on Nietzsche. So this would be sort of seamless transition. I think it might be good to start talking about some of the ideas that kickstart these 27 letters. And I think we can talk maybe just about one or two or three, and it'll be sort of enough to get things going.
Okay, shoot. Let's go.
So something that I thought was really interesting that I didn't get a chance to explore in my lecture series. Like when I was doing my lecture series, I just tried to sort of communicate in the best English that I can what I think Schiller is trying to say in this very dense translated German. And we get from the beginning of Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man that, he says like I'm not really a philosopher. This is like, I'm not really a big believer in the schools of jargon and stuff like that. Like, I'm going to try to stay away from it. And I'm really grateful that anyone's going to listen to me, because I'm not really a philosopher. I don't really deserve this opportunity, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I think to set the stage for this project, Schiller up front confesses that he is a type of Kantian, that he's influenced by Kant. And our listenership, or maybe even you, I don't know, a lot of people will be like, oh, cool. Okay, move on.
Yeah, what does that mean? Yeah.
Move on, Luke. Well, yeah. What does it mean to be a Kantian? I can't believe I'm going to try to answer that question. Like, that is such an insider joke. It's like this nerd just laughing at his own
But I
joke.
mean, what does it mean in respects to what we'll see in the future, at least with...
Well, so Kant wrote about everything, and that's why this is so preposterous to say, well, what does it mean to be a Kantian? Mm-hmm. Because Kant wrote about metaphysics, he wrote about aesthetics, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about religion, he wrote about political affairs, and history. They all sort of interpenetrate.
So then, is it a certain approach then that he takes more than just a exact idea or something that Kant has?
I think my take on how Schiller is a Kantian is, I think it's obvious that he's a Kantian on one level. He says a couple times throughout the book that Kant figured out ethics.
Okay.
Like he's not going to discuss the Kantian ethical project. He has this early on in the book. He says something to the effect of like, if it weren't for Kant's unusual jargon, like everyone would agree that Kant figured out ethics, and it would really only be professorial figures like fighting over the details. But any sane person with common sense would recognize Kant's articulation of ethics as being true. Okay. I haven't done Kantian ethics in a little while, but maybe I should try, for the sake of this, to articulate what Kantian ethics are, because I'm probably going to butcher this, but it is important to probably say that, in short, Kantian ethics is incredible oversimplification, but
for the practicality
for
of this
our purposes,
text,
for our purposes, Kantian ethics is sort of synonymous with this thing known as the categorical imperative.
Okay.
And the categorical imperative, and people argue about this, is a really highfalutin way of expressing the golden rule. And I just said that, and I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but
that's what I was taught in philosophy class. Yeah.
And then you get a lot of philosophical hair splitters saying it's not the golden rule. It is. But if I can try to remember, I haven't taught it in so long, but it's something to the effect of, if you can universalize a maxim of your action in such a way that it doesn't admit of a contradiction, then it's permissible to do it.
Okay.
Now that was really wordy, right? But if it does contradict itself, then you ought not to do it. So you're constrained by this principle of reason. So I'm trying to think of an example of this. If you were like, man, I should really steal the money out of the cash register. He's like, well, then you universalize it for all intelligent beings. Should all rational agents steal the money out of the cash register? And then you realize that you get a contradiction, because if all rational beings stole the money out of the cash register, well, there really wouldn't be cash registers to steal money out of, so it's self-defeating. Therefore you ought not to do it, because that's precisely how you decide. Precisely how you decide whether or not something's good or bad, right? Is that you see if it contradicts itself on a logical level.
Maybe.
But that's what Kant said. It's something to that effect. And I know there are Kantians out there with their monocles like shattering right now, because I probably totally butchered the doctrine. But that's essentially the idea.
Sure. Okay. So then, does Schiller use any kind of universal, at least in the beginning, or like what?
He doesn't.
What
he doesn't.
What is he?
How
is this related? Yeah, I guess.
How is this
related?
From what I recall, he doesn't really use practical examples of it or whatever. And the thing is that Kant will then, in his political writings, and this I'm way less familiar with, will then use this sort of ethical discovery to sort of develop the just state. And I'm not prepared to talk about that at all.
No, that's fine.
But Schiller doesn't really go into any of these nuances. But he just says these things are given, and if you were to put it into the common vernacular, everyone would understand. Because essentially, if you put Kant's categorical imperative into the vernacular, it would just be like, do unto others as they would do unto you.
Yeah.
And there's a great deal there. I've talked to a lot of really great philosophers, and some have said the categorical imperative is the golden rule. And I've talked to some other really great philosophers, and they're like, no way is the categorical imperative the golden rule.
Okay.
Because it's like it's delimiting in nature and not as positive as the golden rule. But that's getting hung up on minutia.
Right. That's what I was saying. So he's a Kantian. So what? Yeah.
Yeah. So he says that if people could understand Kant in regular language, they would automatically assent to it.
So then, is he trying to make it simpler, or I guess that's not his thing, or he's trying to create a common vernacular to articulate?
This is the thing too. Is I should say, you're asking what type of Kantian Schiller is. He's definitely an ethical Kantian.
Okay.
The question that is up for debate is the way that the principles operate for how Kant wrote 3 massive books that deal with how humans judge the world: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, which is where the ethical stuff comes from, and the Critique of Judgment, which is where our judgments of beauty and the sublime come from. The principles that operate in aesthetic judgment are not gonna be necessarily the same. So Kant has a different, and I'm not prepared to really discuss it, but in general, for Kant, this is just the crudest representation of what Kant had to say about aesthetic principles, is that we find things beautiful when we sort of have, when something is presented to our sensuousness and we have trouble subsuming it underneath a category, and we feel a sort of a pleasurable experience as we try to figure out where it belongs. Whereas like when we look at this computer is not necessarily beautiful because it fits our concepts pretty easily, but we may look at this painting behind us or this sketching behind it, and it, for whatever reason, it may not fit the concept as well, and therefore we can admire it and get some sort of pleasurable sense of beauty. And then there's going to be a different sense for the sublime. Take all of what I'm saying about Kant with a grain of salt, but you can see those Kantian aesthetic principles in play, and how Schiller's going to talk about the rational, the sensuous, the play impulse. And the difference may be is that Schiller was very intent on saying that his aesthetic program was going to be morally educative in some way. Kant very tentatively thought that beauty may have made us a better person. But I think most Kantian scholars would say that Kant's judgments, or how he thought the judgments of beauty worked, didn't necessarily make us good people.
So why do we have to be morally educated? Because I know at least in the beginning he kind of talks about how the world's sort of in not shambles, maybe that's too extreme, but at least he talks about the need that we need to be educated. Again, maybe I'm stretching things.
No.
Yeah. I think that's an important kind of like, there is a problem and we have to try to, just like Nietzsche, where he's just like, look, the world's kind of messed up in a sense that, like, you know, art isn't what it used to be. So Schiller's kind of operating from that same kind of, there is a lack and we need to fill it.
Right. So I've gotten off on these trails about Kant, and I need to kind of get back. So what, and thank you for being such a good host.
That's okay. No. I mean, I'm just thinking at least like what's, you know, why?
Sure.
Yeah, like because he kind of set, at least the first letters, at least to me, or at least like 1, 2, and 3 maybe, are kind of like sets up, like he's just trying to set himself up to then dive into the rabbit hole, you know, of this aesthetic education.
Well, so
we need to understand why, or at least he needs to tell us why we need to have this in the first place.
Well, he says something to the effect that there are essentially 2 types of. So the geopolitical situation that Schiller finds himself commenting on is that it's sort of a revolutionary time when people are entertaining a lot of ideas about what the rational conception of the state is going to be. Mm-hmm. And so they've sort of romanticized the state of nature, and what they're trying to do is man everywhere is sort of waking up that he doesn't have to accept the status quo of his governmental institutions. Like, so we take our sort of representative democracy for granted, but at Schiller's time, there are still people very much living underneath different types of monarchies and patriarchies and or I guess monarchies is all inclusive there, but or totalitarian regimes of some sort, dictators, autocrats, and things like that. And for a while, he's going to say, for a while, these forms of government were necessary in order to sort of provide for the fundamental needs of man, to kind of take care of his very, very physical nature. Mm-hmm. But as things have sort of stabilized and man is sort of becoming more and more enlightened, he can sort of begin to reshape these institutions that were imposed upon him. Mm-hmm. But there's a problem that arises here. Do you know what the problem is that he gets at? This tension between, like, there are people that are waking up to the fact that the state can be reformed and the fact that there's been a state that's been imposed upon men from time immemorial.
As in, what's the problem with that?
Yeah, like why he has to talk about art, why he has to make the case for art at all.
Does it have something to do with maybe that we view it as superfluous, or that there's not really, or that beauty isn't, or that we're not really being educated in a moral sense, that we think art isn't really educating us in a moral sense or in some kind of political freedom, in the freedom sense, I guess, as Schiller is going to introduce?
Well, he's going to say Kant has given us the map. Kant gave us the moral compass. Okay, we've got the moral compass.
Right now we need to do something with it.
But why are we still enslaved? Like, why are we still in these unjust states if we've got the book here? It tells us right here, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
Why are we still like that? Especially since we outnumber the people that rule us. Right? So the problem is that the way that Schiller sees it is that humanity has been given the ethical political roadmap, but you still have so many people that are barbarous and married to the sensuous, and it's not just the barbarous and sensuous people, that you can't really evolve. There aren't enough enlightened people to carry out the reformational program.
Well, you're going to have to describe what barbarous and sensuous are, because he does define those two.
I'm going to do my best.
If I remember, I don't know, maybe we could try to... I remember the barbarous is more in the reason side, wasn't it? Or that somebody who stuck to or I can't remember, it was just like...
It's a different type of barbarism.
Yeah, where he kind of... It's not really so much violence as it is kind of like keeping to... Like using reason, but like... It's not really tied to anything ethical. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's a little further than I've prepared for today, but
you can't throw around those terms without trying to define them.
It's not just the sensuous people that are at fault. He's going to say that the people who are enlightened and rational or whatever also have their hands in this predicament as well. The idea is like the idea is, how do we evolve a state if there are people within the state that aren't ready for the revolution?
Right.
But we have to say, why aren't they ready? And I'm trying to recall here, but I mean the sensuous people, from what I understand or what I'm recalling, and this is it's funny because I'm recalling something that I've already taught, but is that it seems to me that they are driven by impulse, instinct, desire, and external determination, right? Like that and this has served unjust states well for a while, because it makes people who haven't sort of arisen out of their animalistic impulses easy to control, right? That's my understanding of more sensuous, maybe animalistic.
But I guess the thing is though is that so we have these people in the reason side who are constrained by principles that might be tyrannical in their own sense, and then we're kind of constrained, and then there are people in the sensuous side who are constrained by tyrannical governments or whatever. So I guess Schiller is trying to say that both of these sides aren't going to give us the freedom that we need. Therefore, we need to find something better, or at least find something that will lead to freedom, and that art is the way, or beauty is the way for us to do that.
Yeah, there's got to be a meeting of the minds somehow. And and I think we should say a little bit about, we said like that the externally determined man is both externally determined from the autocrat that rules him, but desire and this makes him so easily manipulated. But we should say something about the intelligent and rational. Like I think we might want to say something like that. Having that capacity doesn't necessarily make you a good person. Mm-hmm. That capacity might actually contribute to you becoming to be unfeeling towards the unwashed masses. If you know, like, that you are more intelligent, more rational than everyone else, and you see like all these hordes out there, and you see this within a fractured society, you might be like, ew, why would I want to help them? Why would I want to bring about a just state? Why do I want to get my hands dirty in this political revolution for that? Mm-hmm. And I think that's so just because you're rational and maybe even understand the roadmap that Kant has given doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be automatically good and commit yourself to the cause.
Okay.
So I think we've kind of set up the tension a little bit. And, we're at the 41-minute mark, so I probably should bring this to a close. It's a good overview. We connected it to Nietzsche. We did a little bit of Kant, and we set the problem up for Schiller.
I think so.
Good.
I think that's good. Yeah, no, I feel like it's very, I don't know, it's gonna be interesting. I mean, it's a very, I don't want to say sloppy, but it's like a very dense sort of text, so it's gonna be fun to kind of explore it and take it bit by bit. I don't know.
It's gonna be good, man. It's gonna be good.
We'll see what happens.
Till next time. Bye.